I'm going to read from the beginning of a book, not a book of common prayer at all, The Year of Magical Thinking, until I'm tired. Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. Those were the first words I wrote after it happened. The computer dating on the Microsoft Word file reads May 20, 2004. But that would have been a case of my opening the file and reflexively pressing save when I closed it. I had made no changes to that file in May. I had made no changes to that file since I wrote the words in January 2004, a day or two or three after the fact. For a long time I wrote nothing else at all. Life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant. At some point in the instant, in the interest of remembering what seemed most striking about what had happened, I considered adding those words, the ordinary instant. I saw immediately that there was no need to add the word ordinary because there was no forgetting it. The word never ever left my mind. It was the ordinary nature of everything preceding the event that prevented me from truly believing it had happened. I recognize now that there was nothing unusual in this. Confronted with sudden disaster, we all focus on how unremarkable the circumstances were in which the unthinkable occurred. The clear blue sky from which the plane fell. The routine errand that ended on the shoulder with the car in flames. The swings where the children were playing as usual when the rattlesnake struck from the ivy. He was on his way home from work, happy, successful, healthy, and then gone. I read this in the account of a psychiatric nurse whose husband was killed in a highway accident. In 1966, I happened to interview many people who had been living in Honolulu on the morning of December 7, 1941. Without exception, these people began their accounts of Pearl Harbor by telling me what an ordinary Sunday morning it had been. It was just an ordinary, beautiful September day, people still say when asked to describe the morning in New York when American Airlines 11 and United 175 got flown into the World Trade Towers. Even the report of the 9/11 Commission opened on this insistently premonitory and yet dumbstruck narrative note. Tuesday, at September 11th, 2001, dawned temperate and cloudless in the eastern United States. And then gone. In the midst of life, we are in death, Episcopalians say at the grave. Later, I realized that I must have repeated the details of what happened to everyone who came to the house in those first weeks. All those friends and relatives who brought food and made drinks and laid out plates in the dining room table. All those who picked up the plates and froze the leftovers and ran the dishwasher and filled my otherwise empty house even after I had gone into the bedroom and shut the door. Those moments when I was abruptly overtaken by exhaustion are what I remember most clearly about the first days and weeks. I have no memory of telling anyone the details, but I must have done so because everyone seemed to know them. At one point, I considered the possibility that they had picked up the details from one another, but immediately rejected it. The story they had was in each instance too accurate to have been passed from hand to hand. It had come from me. Another reason I knew the story had come from me is that no version I heard included the details I could not yet face. For example, the blood on the living room floor that stayed there until Jose came in the next morning and cleaned it up. Jose was part of our household. Jose was supposed to be flying to Las Vegas later that day, December 31, but he never went. Jose was crying that morning as he cleaned up the blood. When I told him what had happened, he had not understood. Clearly, I was not the ideal teller of the story. Something about my version had been too offhand, too elliptical. Something in my tone had failed to convey the central fact. I would encounter the same failure later when I had to tell Quintana. But only when Jose saw the blood did he understand. I'd picked up the abandoned syringes and EKG electrodes before he came in that morning, but I could not face the blood. In outline, it is now, as I begin to write this, the afternoon of October 4, 2004. 9 months and 5 days ago, at approximately 9 o'clock on the evening of December 30th, 2003, my husband, John Gregory Dunne, appeared to or did experience at the table where he and I had just sat down to dinner in the living room of our apartment in New York a massive coronary event that caused his death. Our only child, Quintana, had been for the previous 5 nights unconscious in an intensive care unit at Beth Israel Medical Center's Singer Division, where what had seemed a case of the December flu sufficiently severe to take her to an emergency room on Christmas morning had exploded into pneumonia and septic shock. This is my attempt to make sense of the period that followed. Weeks and then months that cut loose any fixed idea I ever had about death, about illness, about probability and luck, about good fortune and bad, about marriage and children and memory, about grief, about the ways in which people do and do not deal with the fact that life ends, about the shallowness of sanity, about life itself. I have been a writer my entire life. As a writer, even as a child, long before what I wrote began to be published. I developed a sense that meaning itself was resident in the rhythm of words and sentences and paragraphs. A technique for withholding whatever it was I thought or believed behind an increasingly impenetrable polish. The way I write is who I am or have become. Yet this is a case where I wish I had, instead of words and their rhythms, a cutting room, equipped with an Avid, a digital editing system on which I could touch a key and collapse the sequence of time, show you simultaneously all the frames of memory that come to me now. Let you pick the takes, the marginally different expressions, the variant readings of the same lines. This is a case in which I need more than words to find the meaning. This is a case in which I need whatever it is I think or believe to be penetrable, if only for myself. December 30, 2003, a Tuesday, we had seen Quintana in the 6th floor ICU at Beth Israel. We had come home. We had discussed whether to go out for dinner or eat in. I said I would build a fire we could eat in. I built the fire. I started dinner. I asked John if he wanted a drink. I got him a scotch and gave it to him in the living room where he was reading. The book he was reading was by David Fromkin, bound galley of Europe's last summer, who started the Great War in 1914. I finished getting dinner. I set the table in the living room where, when we were home alone, we would eat within sight of the fire. I find myself stressing the presence of the fire because fires were important to us. I grew up in California. John and I lived there together for 24 years. In California, we heat our houses by building fires. We build fires even on summer evenings because the fog comes in. Fires say we are home, we have drawn the curtain, we are safe through the night. I lit the candles. John asked for a second drink before sitting down. I gave it to him. We sat down. My attention was on the salad. John was talking, then he wasn't. At one point in the seconds or minutes before he stopped talking, he had asked me if I had used single malt scotch for the second drink. I said, no, I used the same scotch I used for the first drink. Good, he had said. I don't know why, but I don't think you should mix them. At another point in these seconds or that minute, he had been talking about why World War I was the critical event from which the entire rest of the 20th century flowed. I have no idea which subject we were on, the Scotch or World War I. at the instant he stopped talking. I only remember looking up. His left hand was raised and he was slumped motionless. At first I thought he was making a failed joke, an attempt to make the difficulty of the day seem manageable. I remember saying, "Don't do that." When he did not respond, my first thought was that he had started to eat and choked. I remember trying to lift him far enough from the back of the chair to give him the Heimlich. I remember the sense of his weight as he fell forward, first against the table, then to the floor. In the kitchen by the telephone, I had taped a card with the New York Presbyterian ambulance numbers. I had not taped these numbers by the telephone because I anticipated a moment like this. I had taped the numbers by the telephone in case someone in the building needed an ambulance. Not me, someone else. I called one of the numbers. A dispatcher asked if he was breathing. I said, "Just come." When the paramedics came, I tried to tell them what had happened. Before I could finish, they had transformed the living room into an emergency department. One of them was talking to the hospital about the EKG they seemed already to be transmitting. Another was opening the first or second of what would be many syringes for injection. Epinephrine, lidocaine, procainamide. Those names came to mind, but I have no idea from where. I remember saying that he might have choked. This was dismissed with a finger swipe. The airway was clear. They seemed now to be using defibrillating paddles in an attempt to restore a rhythm. They got what could have been a normal heartbeat, or I thought they did. We had all been silent. There was a sharp jump, then lost it and started again. "He's still fibbing," I remember the one on the telephone saying. V-fibbing, John's cardiologist said the next morning when he called from Nantucket. They would have said V-fibbing, V for ventricular. Maybe they said V-fibbing and maybe they did not. Atrial fibrillation did not immediately or necessarily cause cardiac arrest. Ventricular did. Maybe ventricular was the given. I remember trying to straighten out what would happen next. Since there was an ambulance crew in the living room, the next logical step would be going to the hospital. It occurred to me that the crew could decide very suddenly to go to the hospital and I would not be ready. I would not have in hand what I needed to take. I would waste time, get left. I found my handbag and a set of keys and a summary John's doctor had made of his medical history. When I got back to the living room, the paramedics were watching the computer monitor. I could not see the monitor, so I watched their faces. I remember one glancing at the others. When the decision was made to move, it happened very fast. I followed them to the elevator and asked if I could go with them. They said they were taking the gurney down first. I could go in the second ambulance. One of them waited with me for the elevator to come back up. By the time he and I got into the second ambulance, the ambulance carrying the gurney was pulling away from the front of the building. The distance from our building to the part of New York Presbyterian that used to be New York Hospital is 6 crosstown blocks. I have no memory of sirens, no memory of traffic. When we arrived at the emergency entrance to the hospital, the gurney was already disappearing into the building. A man was waiting in the driveway. Everyone else in sight was wearing scrubs. He was not. "Is this the wife?" he said to the driver. Then turned to me. "I'm your social worker," he said. And I guess that is when I must have known. Quote, "I opened the door and I seen the man in the dress greens and I immediately knew. This was what the mother of a 19-year-old killed by a bomb in Iraq said on an HBO documentary quoted by Bob Herbert in the New York Times. Quote, "But I thought that if, as long as I didn't let him in, he couldn't tell me. And then none of that would have happened. So he kept saying, 'Ma'am, I need to come in.' And I kept saying, 'I'm sorry, but you can't come in.'" When I read this at breakfast almost 11 months after the night with the ambulances and the social worker, I recognized the thinking as my own. Inside the emergency room, I could see the gurney being pushed into a cubicle, propelled by more people in scrubs. Someone told me to wait in the reception area. I did. There was a line for admittance paperwork. Waiting in the line seemed the constructive thing to do. Waiting in the line said there was still time to deal this. I had copies of the insurance cards in my handbag. This was not a hospital I had ever negotiated. New York Hospital was the Cornell part of New York Presbyterian. The part I knew was the Columbia part at 168th and Broadway, 20 minutes away. Too far. But I could make this unfamiliar hospital work. I could be useful. I could arrange the transfer to Columbia Presbyterian once he was stabilized. I was fixed on the details of this imminent transfer to Columbia when the social worker reappeared and guided me from the paperwork line into an empty room off the reception area. "You can wait here," he said. I waited. The room was cold, or I was. I wondered how much time had passed between the time I called the ambulance and the arrival of the paramedics. It had seemed no time at all, but it must have been several minutes. I used to have on a bulletin board in my office, for reasons having to do with a plot point in a movie, a pink index card on which I had typed a sentence from the Merck manual about how long the brain can be deprived of oxygen. The image of the pink index card was coming back to me in the room off the reception area. Quote, "Tissue anoxia for 4 to 6 minutes can result in irreversible brain damage or death." I was telling myself that I must be misremembering the sentence when the social worker reappeared. He had with him a man he introduced as your husband's doctor. There was a silence. "He's dead, isn't he?" I heard myself say to the doctor. The doctor looked at the social worker. "It's okay," the social worker said. "She's a pretty cool customer." They took me into the curtained cubicle where John lay. They asked if I wanted a priest. I said yes. A priest appeared and said the words. I thanked him. They gave me the clip in which John kept his driver's license and credit cards. They gave me the cash that had been in his pocket. They gave me his watch. They gave me his cell phone. They gave me a plastic bag in which they said I would find his clothes. I thanked them. The social worker asked if he could do anything more for me. I said he could put me in a taxi. He did. I thanked him. "Do you have money for the fare?" he asked. I said I did, the cool customer. When I walked into the apartment and saw John's jacket and scarf still lying on the chair where he had dropped them when he came in from seeing Quintana at Beth Israel, I wondered what an uncool customer would be allowed to do. Break down, require sedation, scream. I remember thinking that I needed to discuss this with John. There was nothing I did not discuss with John. Because we were both writers and both worked at home, our days were filled with the sound of each other's voices. I did not always think he was right, nor did he always think I was right, but we were each the one the other trusted. There was no separation between our interests or investments in any given situation. Many people assumed that we must be, since sometimes one and sometimes the other would get the better review, the bigger advance, in some way competitive, that our private life must be a minefield of professional envies and resentments. This was so far from the case that the general insistence on it came to suggest certain lacunae in the popular understanding of marriage. That had been one more thing we discussed. What I remember about the apartment the night I came home alone from New York Hospital was how quiet it was. In the plastic bag I had been given, there were a pair of corduroy pants, a wool shirt, a belt, and I think nothing else. The legs of the pants had been slit open, I suppose, by the paramedics. There was blood on the shirt. The belt was braided. I remember putting his cell phone in the charger on his desk. I remember putting his silver clip in the box in the bedroom in which we kept passports and birth certificates. I remember combining the cash that had been in his pocket with the cash in my own bag, smoothing the bills, taking special care to interleave 20s with 20s, 10s with 10s, 5s and 1s with 5s and 1s. I remember thinking as I did this that he would see that I was handling things. When I saw him in the curtained cubicle in the emergency room at New York Hospital, there was a chip in one of his teeth, I suppose from the fall, since there were also bruises on his face. When I identified his body the next day at Frankie Campbell, the bruises were not apparent. It occurred to me that masking the bruises must have been what the undertaker meant when I said no embalming, and he said, in that case, we'll just clean him up. The part with the undertaker remains remote. I had arrived there so determined to avoid any inappropriate response, tears, anger, helpless laughter at the Oz-like hush, that I had shut down all response. After my mother died, the undertaker who picked up her body left in its place on the bed an artificial rose. My brother had told me this, offended to the core. I would be armed against artificial roses. I remember making a brisk decision about a coffin. I remember that in the office where I signed the papers, there was a grandfather's clock not running. John's nephew, who was with me, mentioned to the undertaker that the clock was not running. The undertaker, as if pleased to elucidate a decorative element, explained that the clock had not run in some years, but was retained as, quote, a kind of memorial, unquote, to a previous incarnation of the firm. He seemed to be offering the clock as a lesson. I concentrated on Quintana. I could shut out what the undertaker was saying, but I could not shut out the lines I was hearing as I concentrated on Quintana. Full fathom 5, thy father lies, those are pearls that were his eyes. 8 months later, I asked the manager of our apartment building if he still had the log kept by the doorman for the night of December 30. I knew there was a log. I'd been for 3 years president of the board of the building. The log was intrinsic to the building procedure. The next day, the manager sent me the page for December 30. According to the log, the doormen that night were Michael Flynn and Vasily Ionescu. I had not remembered that. Vasily Ionescu and John had a routine with which they amused themselves in the elevator. A small game between an exile from Jescu's Romania and an Irish Catholic from West Hartford, Connecticut, based on a shared appreciation of political posturing. So where is Bin Laden, Vasily would say when John got onto the elevator, the point being to come up with ever more improbable suggestions. Could Bin Laden be in the penthouse, in the maisonette, in the fitness room? When I saw Vasily's name on the log, it occurred to me that I could not remember if he had initiated this game when we came in from Beth Israel North in the early evening of December 30th. The log for that evening showed only 2 entries, fewer than usual, even for a time of the year when most people in the building left for better climates. Note, paramedics arrived at 9:20 p.m. for Mr. Dunne. Mr. Dunne was taken to hospital at 10:05 p.m. Note, light bulb out on AB passenger elevator. The AB elevator was our own elevator. The elevator on which the paramedics came up at 9:20 p.m., the elevator on which they took John and me downstairs to the ambulance at 10:05. The elevator on which I returned alone to our apartment at a time not noted. I had not noticed a light bulb out. I noticed that the paramedics were in the apartment for 45 minutes. I had always described it as 15 or 20 minutes. If they were here that long, does it mean that he was alive? I put this question to a doctor I knew. Sometimes they'll work that long, he said. It was a while before I realized that this in no way addressed the question. The death certificate, when I got it, gave the time of death as 10:18 p.m., December 30th. I'd been asked before I left the hospital if I would authorize an autopsy. I'd said yes. I later read that asking a survivor to authorize the autopsy is seen in hospitals as delicate, sensitive, often the most difficult of the routine steps that follow a death. Doctors themselves, according to many studies, experience considerable anxiety about making the request. They know that an autopsy is essential to the learning and teaching of medicine, but they also know that the procedure touches a primitive dread. If whoever it was at New York Hospital who asked me to authorize an autopsy experienced such anxiety, I could have spared him or her. I actively wanted an autopsy. I actively wanted an autopsy even though I had seen some in the course of doing research. I knew exactly what occurs: the chest opened like a chicken in a butcher's case, the face peeled down, the scale in which the organs are weighed. I had seen homicide detectives avert their eyes from an autopsy in progress. I still wanted one. I needed to know how and why and when it had happened. In fact, I wanted to be in the room when they did it. I'd watched those other autopsies with John. I owed him his own. But I did not trust myself to rationally present this point, so I did not ask. If the ambulance left our building at 10:05 and death was declared at 10:18, the 13 minutes in between were just bookkeeping, bureaucracy, making sure the hospital procedure was observed, the paperwork was done, and the appropriate person was on hand to do the sign-off, inform the cool customer. The sign-off, I later learned, was called the pronouncement, as in pronounced 10:18 p.m. I had to believe he was dead all along. If I did not believe he was dead all along, I would have thought I should have been able to save him. Until I saw the autopsy report, I continued to think this anyway. An example of delusionary thinking, the omnipotent variety. Should we do you want to do some QA?
You can go till 6:30.
Okay. He told me I could go longer. A week or two before he died, when we were having dinner in a restaurant, John asked me to write something in my notebook for him. He always carried cards on which to make notes, 3x6 cards printed with his name that he slipped into an inside pocket. At dinner, he had thought of something he wanted to remember, but when he looked in his pockets, he found no cards. "I need you to write something down," he said. It was, he said, for his new book, not for mine, a point he stressed because I was at the time researching a book that involved sports. This was the note he dictated. Coaches used to go out after a game and say, "You played great." Now they go out with state police as if this were a war and they the military. The militarization of sport. When I gave him the note the next day, he said, "You can use it if you want to." What did he mean? Did he know he would not write the book? Did he have some apprehension, a shadow? Why had he forgotten to bring cards to dinner that night? Had he not warned me when I forgot my own notebook that the ability to make a note when something comes to mind was the difference between being able to write and not being able to write? Was something telling him that night that the time for being able to write was running out? One summer when we were living in Brentwood Park, we fell into a pattern of stopping work at 4 in the afternoon and going out to the pool. He would stand in the water reading. He reread Sophie's Choice several times that summer, trying to see how it worked. While I worked in the garden. It was a small, even miniature garden with gravel paths and a rose arbor and beds edged with thyme and Santolina and feverfew. I'd convinced John a few years before that we should tear out a lawn to plant this garden. To my surprise, since he had shown no previous interest in gardens, he regarded the finished product as an almost mystical gift. Just before 5 on those summer afternoons, we would swim and then go into the library wrapped in towels to watch Tenko, a BBC series then in syndication about a number of satisfyingly predictable English women. One was immature and selfish, another seemed to have been written with Mrs. Miniver in mind, who had been imprisoned by the Japanese in Malaya during World War II. After each afternoon's Tenko segment, we would go upstairs and work another hour or two. John in his office at the top of the stairs, me in my glassed-in porch across the hall. It had become my office. At 7 or 7:30, we would go out to dinner, many nights at Morton's. Morton's felt right that summer. There was always shrimp quesadilla, chicken with black beans. There was always someone we knew. The room was cool and polished and dark, but you could see the twilight outside. John did not like driving at night by then. This was one reason I later learned that he wanted to spend more time in New York, a wish that at the time remained entirely mysterious to me. One night that summer, he asked me to drive home after a dinner at Anthea Silber's house on Camino Palmero in Hollywood. I remember thinking how remarkable this was. Anthea lived less than a block from a house in which we had lived from 1967 until 1971, so it was not a question of reconnoitering a new neighborhood. It had occurred to me as I started the ignition that I could count on my fingers the number of times I had driven when John was in the car. The single other time I could remember that night was once spelling him on a drive from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. He had been dozing in the passenger seat of the Corvette we then had. He had opened his eyes. After a moment, he had said very carefully I might take it a little slower. I had no sense of speed and glanced at the speedometer. I was doing 120. Yet, a drive across the Mojave was one thing. There had been no previous time when he'd asked me to drive home from dinner in town. This evening on Camino Palmero was unprecedented. So was the fact that at the end of the 40-minute drive to Brentwood Park, he pronounced it, quote, well driven. He mentioned those afternoons with the pool and the garden in Tenko several times during the year before he died. Philip Arias, in The Hour of Our Death, points out that the essential characteristic of death as it appears in the Song of Roland is that the death, even if sudden or accidental, gives advance warning of its arrival. Gawain is asked, "Oh, good my lord, think you then so soon to die?" Gawain answers, "I tell you that I shall not live 2 days." Arias notes neither his doctor nor his friends nor the priests know as much about it as he. Only the dying man can tell how much time he has left. You sit down to dinner. You can use it if you want to, John had said when I gave him the note he had dictated a week or two before. And then gone. I think we could do some questions if you want.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, and you'll need to ask your question loudly because we don't have a mic prepared for it. Here's your chance. The first one is always the hardest.
You don't need to. Yes.
Robert.
I want to thank you for that very moving reading first and change the subject entirely, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
We are 2 months into Obama. I'm waiting to see the article you'll write about it, but could you give us a sneak preview?
I haven't even had the heart to address this. I don't know. I mean, we can only hope. You don't want to jinx it. I mean, you know, I was not terribly encouraged by the financial people, but on the other hand, I'm not terribly encouraged by the financial situation either. So who knows? It would take time.
Okay, I'll hang on to hope.
Yeah, hang on for a minute.
How many of you have read The Year of Magical Thinking? Look at that, Joan.
Well, amazing. Well,
I have a question. I want to say thank you first. I'm a great admirer of all of your work, and I read The Year of Magical Thinking after my parents passed away, and it was really important for me in sort of working through the experience and hearing sort of transcendent depiction of mourning. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about interviewing.
yeah.
One of the lines that has always stuck with me from Slouching Toward Bethlehem is that writers are always selling somebody out.
Yeah, I didn't mean what most people have taken that to mean. Most people have taken it to mean that I betrayed them. No, what I meant was there is no way that you can accurately portray another person, it seems to me. They are always going to feel that you haven't. If they were open with you, they are going to regret it because they're going to feel that no one who's doing an interview is going to, even if they admire you more than life itself, they're in the way they see you is not going to be the way you see yourself, and so it's going to be unsettling to the person who's written about. I mean, we see this all the time in people who are written about, unless they're really hard cases, you know, and haven't formed and have public views of themselves, which is most of us don't have public views of ourselves.
Stephen, right?
Thank you very much for the reading. I was moved when I read the book, but perhaps even more so hearing it with your own voice. My question has to do with the decision and how you were involved with the adaptation for the stage version of the book.
I was very much involved, yeah.
And how that came about?
It came about because around the time the book was published, Scott Rudin, the producer, came to me. He's a producer I'd worked with before, and said, "Why don't you? We could do a play." I'd never done a play, and so I immediately said no. And I was leaving for a book tour, and this was complicated by the fact that my daughter had died about 2 months before, 6 weeks before. And I had just had the funeral, actually. Now I was going on a book tour. And I was not myself. And about halfway through the first flight on this book tour, it occurred to me that, in fact, I was no longer the person I had been. I was no longer John's wife. I was no longer Quintana's mother. Maybe this was the very time to do something I'd never done before. So Scott kept calling me about this when I was on the road. And so I arranged to see him when I got back to town. But by that time, he'd already involved David Hare as the director. And they had dates for an opening, right? And yeah, so it just happened. I mean, and I worked with Scott and David on doing the adaptation, and once Vanessa came in, also with Vanessa, because she had very definite thoughts about what worked for her and what didn't.
Thanks, Stephen. Are you doing a technical thing or asking a question, Mark?
Oh, I'm doing a technical.
Oh, okay. All right. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm just gonna stand up. It's such an honor for me to meet with you. I finished your book about a day ago, and I must say that it spoke directly to me. I had my husband died also very suddenly, quite a long time ago, 35 years ago. But as you can imagine, it doesn't
Seems
go
like
away.
yesterday,
Yes,
yeah.
it doesn't go
Yeah.
away. And when you wrote, things happen in an instant. Your experience happened to be something as quotidian or mundane as dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And we were watching television, my young children and I and my husband, and he died mid-sentence.
Yeah.
And so when you wrote that, dinner and then gone,
Mm.
it was as if it had come from my thoughts. And I want you to know that you do speak for yourself, but you do speak for other people's experiences. You touch them exactly. And how grand it is for you to write that, and how grand it is for people to read that. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
John.
Yeah, just a question, Joan, on the form of magical thinking. When and how did the form of doing it come to you?
Well, I had when I started typing some notes from the period. They started out being notes about Quintana's being sick, right? So I wanted to kind of track what had happened. And then in the notebooks that I'd been using when Quintana at the hospital, there were these other things that had to do with John's death. So I just typed those along with it. And then about 2 days later, I started thinking to myself, there's only one way to organize this. And the way to organize it is such and such. But in point of fact, then I realized that if I was thinking of how to structure it, I was thinking of writing a book. So I had thought how to structure. It had occurred to me that the only way to structure it was by repeating over and over again the central event, John's death. And every time you came back to it, you would come at it from a slightly different angle. It'd be a different, well, you know what an angle is. So it was a very simple structure, once I thought of it, which I did almost immediately. I wanted to replicate that. Also, it kind of replicates the obsessiveness of the experience of grief.
When also did the notion of magical thinking come to you?
I don't know, but it was quite early, because it was before I started really writing it. It was when I was making notes, because in the early notes there's a different version of the title, which I decided against because it sounded too much like a movie that had already existed, The Year of Thinking Magically.
First of all, thank you for that. I read the book and I saw the play, and it occurred to me while you were reading that the play, as much as I enjoyed Mr. Gregory, could have been you up there reading the book. It was as moving as though we were watching it in theater. I'm wondering what it's like for you to have something so intimate, so personal, made so public, both in a book but then again in theater.
Well, I never thought of it as, if I thought of it as personal, I would have really taken offense. What I mean is, I would have taken offense that this had happened to me. If that way lay madness. So I always thought of it as a kind of distanced, that was how I solved the question of self-pity, by thinking it hadn't happened to me personally.
Thank you for the question, Sally. One or two more? You'll have to speak very loudly. I can't even see the...
I just had a question, two questions, sort of. One is, do
No, I don't own a Kindle. It's just be one, for me it would just be one more thing to carry around, you know. Lose at the airport. People who have them say they're wonderful, but I haven't felt that urge. I would like, I mean, I read stuff on the net a lot, and I do a lot of research on the net. So I'm used to the idea of reading something on a screen is fine for me. In fact, it's easier than carrying it around. But naturally, I still want my own books to be in book form.
One more.
I'm curious if you have your own favorites of your works or passages or even just lines that you look back on and think, yeah, I worded that right. That still feels good to me.
Once in a while you think that about something. And then it changes. Then you start thinking it about something else. And go back and look at the thing you had originally thought, and it doesn't resonate.